because I had never been treated the way some of the doctors wanted to treat me.
That was the way it was.
And we used to have to go around to the side door to go in.
I went home again crying.
There was no school here I could go to.
I realized that there were a lot of differences.
We were in there like sardines.
We had our own counter in the back of the store.
We were angry. The majority of us was angry.
We're closing the school for black people.
That the Klan knew where he lived, and the Klan knew where his children went to school.
We did not go through the front door like everybody else. We went through that side door.
No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream.
GHS, like so many hospitals in the South, has a history of racial segregation that is absolutely a part of who we are. But rather than try to minimize it or forget about it or pretend that it never happened, we've decided to take a different path. And I think that path is to really unpack it, understand it, and see what we can learn from it and see how those lessons can then serve us in terms of our path forward towards the future.
The year was 1912. The Titanic had just gone down south of Canada. New Mexico and Arizona were admitted to the United States of America as the 47th and 48th states. Woodrow Wilson was elected president, and the Red Sox won the World Series. In the quiet of Greenville, South Carolina, the first public hospital, City Hospital, was opened on January 10th with 84 beds to a county population of 70,000. It was a great year, even touted in one local newspaper as the best year in the history of Greenville County. 5 railroads served the city. There were 6 public schools and 47 churches. If 1912 was generally a good year for Greenville, there was one troubling development. City Council wrote into the city code a strict segregation ordinance. Nancy Vance Ashmore, in her 1986 book, Greenville Woven from the Past, says that, in the name of preserving peace, preventing conflict, and ill feeling between the white and colored races, the ordinance called for the use of separate blocks for residences, restaurants, places of amusement, stores, and places of business of all kinds. Later ordinances explicitly called for the separation of races in schools, churches, and public buildings. Integration was considered a misdemeanor. Violations could be fined $100 or jailed for 30 days on each count. So in 1912, Greenville was a thoroughly segregated city. The new ordinance drove black business and other activities to specific parts of the city and forced a location pattern that remained for decades. It also resulted in the new hospital being segregated. Until well past the middle of the century, rooms for African American patients and white patients were in separate areas of the hospital. In the South, where nearly 90% of the nation's black population lived, Jim Crow laws limited interaction between the races in parks, libraries, schools, restaurants, bathrooms, bus stations, theaters, hotels, and even pools. Many believed that the majority of whites believed African Americans were content with their social and economic conditions, despite the limitations on their intellectual development and economic success.
Greenville was a very segregated community, similar to what you found throughout the South. Schools were segregated. That was the way it was. I walked by Greenville High School here on the way to Sterling the back of Greenville High, and it sort of never dawned on you why you walking by this nice school and you can't go.
'Cause I know here, we had to go to, colored bathrooms. If you go uptown to Woolworths, we had our own counter in the back of the store. And we just knew we did what we had to do at that time.
There were also gaps and disparities in employment between the races.
There was a time if you were black and you worked in Greenville, you either worked at the Donaldson Air Force Base, which was located here, or you worked on a textile mill. Those were basically the two options that you had.
Traditionally in the South, white people have distrusted or sometimes feared or thought they disliked African Americans in general, but they have dearly loved those African Americans that they have come to know well personally.
The national landscape of race relations began to change more and more after the halfway mark of the 20th century. Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka was a landmark decision of the United States Supreme Court that declared state laws establishing separate public schools for African American and white students unconstitutional. The decision overturned the Plessy versus Ferguson decision of 1896, which allowed state-sponsored segregation. Handed down on May 17, 1954, the court's unanimous decision stated that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. This ruling paved the way for integration in the civil rights movement. Other events in the South, like the Montgomery Bus Boycott in 1955, led the U.S. Supreme Court to rule that even segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. The early 1960s ushered in a new wave of activism by both whites and African Americans to challenge the minds, habits, and even the government on the ways of the past. The March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, led by a young Baptist minister from Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr., eventually resulted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, U.S. law intending to end all discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin.
When I was in Tuskegee, his Martin Luther King's church was about as far as from here to the Augusta Road for me. About every Saturday we would go to Montgomery. Martin Luther King would be in the drugstore there. Because they were stopping all blacks. If you made a turn too far, they'd stop you, and he was out there taking care of the problem. So matter of fact, he told me, said, "Now, Levi, I'm having a meeting Sunday. And I want you to come. I'm gonna break up all this foolishness." I told him, "Yeah, I'll be there, But I didn't go. I had a yellow streak down my back. I was afraid. But I could have, if I had not been afraid, I could have been one of the main marchers, his right-hand man, because he asked me to come. But,
Martin Luther King Jr. continued to be a champion for civil rights during the 1960s and led many nonviolent protests for freedom and equality all over the South. His mission to help minorities reach the promised land, as he called it, was cut short by a gunman's bullet in 1968. The news shocked the nation, the world, and the citizens of Greenville.
Well, I got a call that we needed to go. It may have been from Mr. Payton that we needed to go to this. Somebody needed to go to this funeral, and me feeling the way I do about things, I felt like okay. They said we need to be there. I'm going. Washington Woods was sending a limousine and taking some of us, so I said, of course, I'll be up early in the morning and be ready to go. So I did. And I didn't even think about calling in. But when I got back to work the next day, they asked me, why weren't you at work? And I told them I was sick. I took some pictures of Mr. Martin Luther King in his casket. And as I was taking those pictures, I didn't realize that I was not supposed to take those pictures. But anyway, one of the newsmen cameras zoomed in real close and showed me on the nightly news. And I did not know that because it was late when we got back from Atlanta. Everybody saw it but me. So I They didn't say, they didn't mention it again, but I found out that they knew it, but they just didn't say anything to me.
As change came to the upstate of South Carolina from a sit-in at the H.S. Kress store downtown in 1963, the decision from the Supreme Court in Peterson versus Greenville set the precedent that private citizens must ignore local segregation ordinances because they violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment.
It was sort of an accepted way of life until about the late 60s, okay, when the sit-ins started. Shortly after that, and that was the public accommodation, the marches to the library, and we had a couple of real activist ministers here. It started with the library, then the Woolworths, then First Baptist Church here led to that. One of the biggest one was when Jackie Robinson came to Greenville and was not allowed to sit in the waiting room at the downtown Greenville airport at that time. That was a big event. And then we had the A.J. Whittenberg, who was a local businessman here, filed the school desegregation suit.
Integration of the schools took place. My youngest son, who's now 50, he was in the 3rd grade at Augusta Circle School. When they integrated, they came in and they put him in a separate grade and brought in a black teacher, and he did very well. But he made a bad grade on one course, and I said, "Bob, what's the problem?" He says, "Well, you know, they've disintegrated the schools." And I thought that was funny.
We said, well, we either go to jail or we're going to see what's going to happen. We went to the drugstore, and we used to have to go around to the side door to go in. So we went in the front door, asked for a cone ice cream, and we had no problems. They served us.
But old habits die hard, and not everyone was in agreement of the new wave of ideals. Throughout his earlier congressional career, South Carolina Senator Strom Thurmond opposed almost every major civil rights initiative. In 1956, he authored the infamous Southern Manifesto, a document signed by 19 of the 22 Southern senators that urged the South to defy, as they put it, the Supreme Court's clear abuse of judicial power in outlawing segregation in public schools. In 1957, he executed the longest filibuster in history while trying to halt the first Civil Rights Act proposed in the Senate and backed by Eisenhower.
There's not enough troops in the army to force the Southern people to break down segregation and admit the Negro race into our theaters, into our swimming pools, into our homes, and into our churches.
Senator Thurmond had a strong influence in Greenville and at the Greenville General Hospital during his multiple visits, at the invitation of the Board of Trustees. City Hospital had naturally gone through major changes in over 30 years. For instance, in 1935, the City Council and Board of Governors decided to change the name to General Hospital. After several major facility expansions, a new Greenville General Hospital opened on Wednesday, June 24, 1953. A few things that hadn't changed by the early 1960s were the separation of races within the hospital wards, the diversity of the Board of Trustees, and many local opinions. There were also still many gaps in equality in terms of employment of staff.
There was an old gray wing, and I remember going to see my grandmother. We did not go through the front door like everybody else. You went through that side door, and it was called the Corbett Wing. And I think, I'm not sure, but I think it was the first part of the hospital system, and our portion was built on. But we had to go through that door to see our family. And growing up, I didn't know any difference. But after I went to work there, I realized that there were a lot of difference.
In the early days, you know, we had most of the rooms, there were a few private rooms, but most of the rooms were either semi-private, and we had 4 large wards on the Corbett Wing. They were, I don't know how many beds were there, I would say 20 to 30 beds at least in either ward, and we had Ward 100, 101, One of them would be for black and one would be for white patients. And on the second floor, it was the same way, 200 and 201. They were mostly for white patients because we had a lot more of those.
Well, we had nurseries on two different wards. The white nurses, the personnel in labor, and when they delivered were on the one ward. The black persons, when in labor, were on another ward.
There was a white cafeteria and there was the colored cafeteria. But we all enjoyed the colored cafeteria because when we went to lunch, it was just us. And we were angry when they closed it. We had our own food line, and we went through it, and we enjoyed us to get together with the other members of the staff. But when they told us that they were closing it, and we had to go around to the other side, to the white side, we were angry. The majority of us was angry because we didn't want to go around there. That meant that we had to act professional. I had to act professional.
We had different cafeterias, the black cafeterias, the white cafeterias. We had the white wards and the black wards. They all got the same food, they got the same care, and you had so many patients you had to work with, and the patients enjoyed you doing their AM cares and PM cares, so it wasn't no problem with the patients. They was very pleased, and they always enjoyed you working with them.
As far as the nurses were concerned, I don't think they made any difference. They treated patients, not color. They treated patients.
The Hospital Construction and Survey Act, or Hill-Burton Act, were opportunities at federal monies available to help build hospitals. Greenville General Hospital accepted and used these funds to help expand their main facilities and build their first satellite space in Greer, Allen Bennett Memorial Hospital. The original plans of General Hospital's expansion were to keep the facilities for African Americans and whites, quote, separate but equal, end quote, which was an allowable provision with federal monies until 1963. In the late 50s and early 60s, the Board of Trustees generally agreed to avoid the appearance of pushing integration. Putting African Americans in supervisory capacities over white staff members had no place in the South, and conforming to social norms of the community at large seemed the best route to take.
A lot of the blacks, most of them was, all the laundry was black. In the cafeteria, people that worked in the cafeteria were black. And I guess back then, those jobs was a job pretty good because a lot of the blacks worked in the laundries at other, around the Greenville area, or either in a sewing factory.
In 1964, Dr. William Bill Gibson, was with the NAACP, and he recommended that someone in the black community apply for a unit secretary position because he had found out that they were hiring secretaries for the units and there were no black ones, and he thought we should send somebody over there just to see what would happen. And it was recommended that I go. And so I went. I didn't want to. I was scared. I ain't gonna tell a lie. I was scared. I went home crying.
That they would have name tags for all the white. It said Miss so-and-so, RN, and mine said nurse, cook, RN, but I refused to wear it. I refused to wear it until they changed.
I didn't work the carpet area. I worked medical area, which was 8th floor, 6th floor, and 2nd Sims. And it was segregated, so they didn't have any. Just a few, when it's integrated, they had a few black patients until they closed the carpet area, and then they had more. And I was the only black secretary in the medical.
Bob would, from time to time, summons me to either to his room in the hospital or to his home so we could talk about things. And it was an absolute privilege and joy for me to do that. But we were in his home not too long before he died. We were reminiscing together, and he remembered a time when the integration of the patients in the hospital was taking place. And he told me that he during that time, had received a telephone call from a man who identified himself as a leader of the Ku Klux Klan in the area. And he had expressed the unhappiness of the Klan with the changes at the hospital and wanted them stopped and reversed. And also had told Mr. Toomey that if he did not stop them and reverse them, he wanted him to know that the Klan knew where he lived and the Klan knew where his children went to school. And Bob said, I told him, you are talking to the catcher for the Harvard University baseball team, and I still have a baseball bat. Come on over. And that's the last he heard from the Klan.
In 1965, President Bob Toomey reported the completion of integration of all hospital services. And in 1970, after integrating employee services, Toomey's administration adopted the Equal Employment Policy, which stated, "It is the policy of the Greenville Hospital System to provide equal employment opportunities without regard to all phases of employment."
I think the staff thought it was a thing to do, by and large. There were probably a few, like there are out in the regular community, probably people who were resistant to that, but not in Greenville did not. I think it didn't happen overnight, but it certainly was. The staff was welcome.
I was all for it, and I remember when Dr. Martin Luther King was killed, I was working that night on second shift on 6 East at the General, and a lot of the white nurses was really scared because they had started rioting in other cities, and they were scared. They were scared to go home because they didn't know what they was going to do in Greenville. And I thought, well, it ain't bothering me.
Well, when they began to come together, they was a little afraid. They was a little afraid to venture out and go places. And then, later on, they lost their fear and they began to, get into it. But it just smoothed right in. It wasn't too bad.
So they moved everybody up to the 5th floor, 5th west, the west wing of 5th floor, and that went on for a while. We had separate labor rooms. We had 2 large labor rooms, and essentially the white patients were labored on one side and the black patients on the other. But pretty soon that went away.
It just seemed like, well, all of a sudden here we are. We're doing this, and it's like we had been doing it all along. And I think a lot of people were relieved because it took away a lot of stress and tension, I remember the first time one of the girls said, let's go to the coffee shop and have some coffee. And I thought, wow, we haven't been doing this before. But we went down, we had coffee, and from then on, it was just a normal part of us.
They wanted me to come. They needed somebody in the nursing office. They didn't have any, so we need a receptionist there. But I learned later on they wanted somebody of color. So I started to work in the nursing office as a receptionist. That was a lot better than it had been out on the floor.
Miss Long, she was head of pediatrics and OB for a long time. She was really a leader, and she began to hire black folks for other than being a ward secretary or a janitor.
And someone asked me at one time that if I had any problems with the black and the white being together. I had no problems whatsoever. I hired the nurses, I fired the nurses, I assigned the nurses to what they were supposed to do, and it made no difference what color they were or who they were. They got the job that they needed.
Integration came about, and they tore Second Corporate down. But segregation still existed because when a patient was assigned to a semi-private room, where it's two beds in a semi-private room, all the time I'd come to the hospital. Maybe it'd be a white in one bed and a black in the other bed. That was fine. And by the next day, one of them gone. You know. So I asked her, what happened to so-and-so? Well, they didn't want to be in the room together.
When I was a student on pediatrics, this little white boy, they had put him on a bedpan and they had told me, Lavinia, go down there and take him off the bedpan because he's called and said he's finished. So I went down there to take him off the bedpan and he said, no. I said, no, you're not ready to get off? He said, no. He said, I want one of these kind. I said, what do you mean one of these kind? I want a nurse, my kind. I said, okay. I knew what he was saying. So I went back to the desk. I said, he said he want a nurse of this kind. She said, what you mean? He want a white nurse. So she went down there and she came out. She said, Lavinia, I'm gonna kill you. Oh, that stunk. I said, well, thank God he wanted you and not me. Oh, mercy.
It wasn't too bad. Some of the staff was worse than the patients. Some of the doctors was worse. They would say ugly things. Some of the patients came to the desk and they would want a cup of coffee or something and tell me I was sitting on my fat ass and I needed to be up doing something and I needed to give them a cup of coffee. You need to be back in the cotton field, that's what they told me. But I took it.
I remember one patient that was told that she did not want a black head nurse taking care of her child. That's what I was told by another staff member, I think. I don't remember her saying that to me, but I just remember that.
So one day I answered the phone and this young lady said, we have these black people down here and they want to know what they should do. They need some instructions on having a baby, so I gave it to her, you know, basic things. And she said, well, how do you explain that to it, the N word? And of course, I got angry. I said, the same way you explain it to anybody else. And I said, goodbye. And I immediately called the nursing office, and Miss Longshore was on that day. And she came up, and she called down, she said, young lady, I just want you to know that when you said the N word to this nurse up here, you were talking to a black nurse. And so my friend Daisy, she's dead now, we call her Ma, and they call me Boo. And she called me, and she asked me some questions, and she came up and she was laughing. She said, Boo. I said, what? She said, you do sound white on the phone. I said, I do not. I said, I try to sound professional. She said, well, you sound white.
There was a restaurant behind the hospital that had real good food. You know, you could go, people would go get it and bring it back to you or whatever. And she said, let's go have a lunch together. And we did. We went and, well, we left out and went over there and walked in and sat down, and the waitress came over and said, oh, we can't serve you two in here together. And she got really upset, my coworker, and we left. I remember that.
Once Greenville Hospital System had integrated, it became a place where racist attitudes could begin to soften and the healing process from the wounds of racial segregation could begin.
But we were in a time there, we were coming out of a time in which African Americans did not touch white people except to shake hands if the white person offered the hand first. And certainly something like a friendly hug, that was out of the question. Or a hug when somebody was hurting and needing a hug. You know, but when some of us started doing that, not in a way of, in any kind of inappropriate way, but a very appropriate way, and could do that visibly and in public, I think that helped as well. I remember one man, young professional man, African American, he and his wife had a little baby, and they both were working, and they didn't want to put that baby in daycare, and so they had hired a nanny to be there with the little child. And the nanny put the child down for a nap in the early afternoon, and the child died with SIDS in that afternoon. He was the first one to arrive at the emergency room. I was, I don't know, 35, 36 years old. He, I think, was a few years younger than I. Me white, him African American, and after a while he said, "Mister, I feel like I'm gonna fly apart if somebody doesn't hold me. Will you hold me?" I got him in a bear hug, and he got me in a bear hug. And I don't know what people would have thought, and I really didn't care. But we stood there for probably 10 minutes with me holding him together so he didn't fly apart. And the point is, when you're really down into really tough times, skin color don't make a bit of difference. You know, it's having somebody who cares and who has some capacity to help. That's what matters.
The people saw that I loved those children and that my thing was to give them the best of care. Because that's what I did. I took care of them. And I loved them. Anybody's child, always did. I think that came through.
It was not long before, if you were in a terrible accident or you had a heart attack at home, there was a good chance that one of the two people who showed up to take care of you would be African American, sometimes both of them. And there is nothing like being scared you're going to die and having, if you're a white person, being scared you're going to die and having an African American person show up who has the know-how and the skill and the willingness to take care of you and to get you to the hospital for further treatment. And people began to look a little bit differently, you know, when they had that kind of personal experience. And they'd tell their family and neighbors about that sort of thing too.
When you bring new people in who have come from non-segregated communities throughout the nation, they come with a different attitude. And you know, if you look at diversity here at the hospital, if you look at the progress it's making, it's been within the past few years of some real change in leadership. And that's not only at the hospital, but other areas in the community you see, where people have come into this community with different attitudes, different behaviors, and have made a real difference. And that's in industry as well as in the hospital system.
Once white people in the community had personal exposure as patients in particular, or family members of patients, to professional African American persons, either as nurses in the hospital or EMTs and paramedics in the field, or the people that they were beginning to run into in doctors' offices who were lab technicians and whatever they were, and realized that these are people who were well trained, who were good and kind people, who had their best interest at heart. You know, all of that was, I think, went a long way to helping the community accept the changes that were going on.
Over the years, the Greenville Hospital System has become a beacon of light in the upstate of South Carolina, brightening the path of diversity and equality for many residents, patients, visitors, and staff. After years of unchanged habits in Board of Trustees recruitment, in 1977, S.T. Payton, then local NAACP president, questioned board appointments and asked why no minorities or women had ever been elected. Trustees and other legislators agreed that minority groups would be contacted before future board elections. The result was that in September 1979, the first African American, Keith Barksdale, was elected to the board. In 1992, while serving on the board, Dr. Marguerite Seawright Crosby pressured GHS to diversify the leadership team of the hospital, and in 1993, Fred Hobby was introduced as the first African American administrator, and later, the first Chief Diversity Officer under the President Frank Pinckney.
Myself and 4 other employees went down to Atlanta to an institute called the American Institute for Managing Diversity. And we spent a week down there getting trained on diversity. I came back and I began writing the hospital's diversity plan. Periodically, I would submit a draft of the plan, which ultimately became named Managing Diversity for Organizational Performance. And then we began round-the-clock training of all of our employees in all of our facilities. We were under the belief that first, there should be one level of care for any patient who came to Greenville, no matter what made them unique, religious difference, cultural, language, whatever.
I really believe that at this point in time, we are absolutely committed. Every leader at GHS is committed to making sure that we're not following anybody else's lead when it comes to issues of diversity and equality. And we manifest that focus in all kinds of creative programs. For example, we have a supplier diversity program, which is focused on our hospital procurement practices to make sure that we're being inclusive of historically underrepresented businesses. We also have a Physicians Diversity Council, and that council helps us think through creative ways to help diversify the medical staff. And finally, we have a focus on our recruitment and hiring techniques. More recently, we're particularly focused on leadership recruitment to think through how we can be more intentional about making sure that the leadership of GHS mirrors that profile of our employee population, which in turn mirrors that of our patient population.
GHS's recent work in diversity has enabled the organization to distinguish itself as a leader in diversity. I suspect that there are a couple of dates. Certainly when we wrote this plan, that was a bold step to actually reach out and embrace these communities that other hospitals were kind of wishing they'd go away.
Part of how I think that we partner with our community now is that GHS has a Diversity Advisory Council, and that is a hybrid of GHS employees and also key members of the community. And the purpose of that community representation is to really be a conduit of information to flow from the community to GHS. We're one of the largest employers in the upstate, and we have a responsibility to make sure that we're being responsive to what those community concerns are, not only as an employer, but as the largest healthcare provider in the upstate.
I think it's hugely important to share an organization's history. Whatever that history is. If you talk about it just specifically from where we as a system were from a segregation standpoint and then a post-segregation standpoint, that was a big part of our history. Sort of open up to it, embrace it, and see how we made that transition, and celebrate the successes and celebrate the learnings that came from that. So great learnings come out of difficult situations. So I think there are learnings that come out of how this organization handled and evolved and transformed and worked through the issues of segregation. So perhaps an initial lesson is you face big issues. You face them squarely. It doesn't always mean that we do it rapidly, and perhaps there's an argument that we weren't rapid in some areas, but we face it and we have an inspiration, and then it comes from leadership, you know. So I've talked about Mr. Toomey in the past, and I've talked about how I really feel there's been a legacy handed down. So from him to Mr. Skarupa or to even to Mr. Pinckney, leaders face difficult issues, and they move an organization at a pace that makes it successful. So the lesson to me is you face it, you figure out how you're going to move the organization, and then you move the organization forward. And I think we've had some great leaders that have faced multiple issues, but this one in particular. Great learnings come out of difficult situations.
People have come into this community with different attitudes, different behaviors, and have made a real difference.
When you're really down into really tough times, skin color don't make a bit of difference.
That was a bold step.
People saw that I loved those children, and that my thing was to give them the best of care.
I don't know what people would have thought, and I really didn't care.
Leaders face difficult issues.
There should be one level of care for any patient who came to Greenville.
You know, all of that went a long way to helping the community accept the changes that were going on.